Thank you so much for being here today. It's delightful to see such a great audience. I'm just so glad to be in these kind of changing moments. There were many times we couldn't have these events, or everyone was masked, or people were staying home, and we'll have this on film to be online later for those who are not able to attend today. So thanks so much for being here. I wanted to do a land acknowledgement, to think about this place, and to think about this place in relationship to our visiting speakers' work, really. So as everyone knows, we're on this unceded territory, so land that was never given over by deed of the Musqueam people there, and the Squamish people, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And one thing in thinking about this land and the fact that we are not speaking in Musqueam or Tsleil-Waututh, that we're speaking in English, is something about the broader relations of this land. So there is land back, the land back kind of movement, but in the broader sense, there's also a whole number of diverse forms of expression. So literary forms, language, theater, forms of art, forms of knowledge production, things that we call science. So I just want to think about the broader realm of these forms of knowledge that have been often suppressed in different ways and that are also reemergent. I am excited about this talk today to think about these kind of transnational relations. And that is something that, too, in thinking about this place here, and the Anishinaabe scholar, Leanne Bedasamake Simpson's work on the role of internationalism as part of indigeneity, about making relations across linguistic differences, about making transformations, and that is something that I think that today's talk will be addressing in other contexts. So not just within that kind of, there's been a long tendency to kind of do a national container history, like where it's only within Canada or China or one place. And so I think this work speaks to these kind of transnational, translinguistic relations that reminds us too of that history of these transnational, translinguistic relations here on the spot. So I'm welcome to today, and I will turn it over to Prof. visiting from the University of Sydney, and I'm so delighted.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you also. I wanted to thank also Shu Yu Kong, who is in Sydney at present, but who suggested that I might be that I might have something to speak about with you today. I am talking today about a topic that's occupied me for a while, that I'm trying to get my head around, and that this is very much a work in progress. So I do hope that when I conclude the presentation part, I'll be able to hear from all of you. And it comes out of years of working both in troops and with troops in an earlier part of my career, also including when they went on troop, and on sort of more academic reflections that have been the focus of first of my PhD and then of later projects. And so these are three books. This one is about Indonesia, and these two are about forms so the left book is about theater in Fujian, about a Hokkien form called Lianxi, so Pear Garden Theater, often translated as somewhat related to Taiwanese forms as well, and also present in the Southeast Asian diaspora. In the middle is a book where I was involved with editing and translating, contextualizing quote-unquote classical genre of theater, so Kunqu, based in the Yangtze River area, Nanjing, Shanghai, Suzhou being the main sort of troupe areas for Kunqu, and minority stages dealing with various kinds of Chinese-Indonesian performance and public display. And it struck me that these stories, sometimes which are held in common, like the stories in repertoire, some of which may also be known to you, so stories like The White Snake by Sichuan, or The Lute, Ibaji, or some of the stories of the Sui Kang Yan Yi heroes, so Xue Ren Gui, martial histories that were very popular in the late imperial period. So sometimes they're, we get the same story. The Lute is a good example, Pipaji, because we get it in Hokkien forms, in Fujian still performed. We get it in Kunqu forms, still performed, Nanjing, Shanghai, Suzhou, also Beijing, also Hunan. And in Indonesia, we also get it performed in various puppet forms and various, also live action forms. And we also got them in like cartoon, comic book forms and television cartoon forms and various various forms of expression. But the more, these are all projects that are based on products that exist now, right? Performances, often where I could see them myself or I could talk to performers. They're sort of in this period, but all of them required me to look backwards and to think, well, how did this story get to Indonesia? How did it get from this page version to that stage version? Why does this one, the Lute, let's say as an example again, why does it have such a radically different expression in Kunqu and the Yuanxi and the Indonesian form? Sometimes, for instance, the Lute sometimes gets very comic expressions. So the one in Fujian, yeah, I can see that this is surprising some audience members. So it's done as a sort of comical shrew play. Whereas typically people will associate it in the Kunqu forms as a tragedy with a possibly unconvincing happy ending. So I had these sort of presentist projects, and then I felt that they were. This is going to sound a little obvious, but they're very different. And obviously some of the differences. Just Indonesia is a different place from China and the rest of it. But I also felt like they occupied different positions in societies. That the way that Indonesians treated these art forms was very different than the way French or German audiences treated Chinese genres when we brought them on tour. I felt like there was just a basic difference about what they thought Chinese theater, where it was placed in the highbrow, lowbrow spectrum, say. And I think, and so this project today is like, I think that there are historical reasons for that, and I think it'd be good to develop a vocabulary for talking about it, and I haven't found it yet. Perhaps you can help me, but that's how I got here. That's why I'm drawing on such. Many of you looking at the abstract might have been like, Germany, Indonesia, not the same period. Like it looks very apples and oranges, and I recognize that. But I think it's worth taking these two case examples. I'm not very good at abstraction, and I didn't want to try to think through it without objects. And so I'm trying to think these through with two theater makers and writers and directors, people who spend an enormous amount of time putting Chinese narratives in different historical periods into language and performance for the audiences of their time, and to think through why, these, in some sense, very similar projects end up having very different expressions, particularly on that highbrow, lowbrow scale. All right. So just to give you a visual, this is a scene from one of the Indonesian plays, from a play called Si Jing Kui, which is the Hokkien pronunciation of Xue Ren Gui. You can probably see, those of you familiar with Chinese theater, that there are certain influences, but also that the makeup, for instance, is much more, is very localized, and that there are elements of the costume that, to quote a friend in China when I showed them excerpts from this, are just wrong. Is to say, there's an inspiration there, but there is no anxiety about using things and adapting them and localizing them. I wanted to show you also, this is the visual. Let's see, Okay. Okay, I wanted to show you a couple of minutes of a Indonesian student group. So these are people in Jakarta, 2018. So the most recent we're likely to get in, given the COVID problem. So as I said, this is a sort of ordinary high school production, high energy, evidently. Well, I mean, it's not a theater school particularly. I mean, ordinary in the sense it's not diasporic, and it is not a professional company or theater, but obviously people who care a great deal about theater, and this was their trailer. I put it towards the beginning of the presentation because I thought it might help illustrate how eclectic the influences are in the productions, the Indonesian productions that I'm talking about. This is not a production directed by the author, Nano Riantiarno. The original, the premiere was, but I'm heartened to see that it's going around and being produced in various other places without the involvement of the original troupe. And as we'll see sort of later. So because the versions are going to be, the versions that are done of the Riantiarno, of the Teater Koma, which is the name of the author and the name of the troupe, when they do Chinese versions, they're always very eclectic, and they draw on many different ways that Chinese narratives have come to Indonesia. And I thought better than explaining it piece by piece, which we'll see, I'd give you a visual to begin with, so that you can see that. So that's the sort of Indonesian point of departure. And the Western point of departure is, and this is sort of harder to visualize, but this is when I was accompanying the UNC in Paris. You can see the lighting was done by a French theater director. The venue was Théâtre du Soleil, which is the theater of Ariane Mnouchkine, so one of the great sort of centers of world theater for in Europe. Often bringing in troops from Asia, from East and South Asia, from Africa. So what I'm trying to contrast is this sort of very popular, anxiety-free adoption of Chinese narratives for a mass production, for a student group, contrasted with the way that I found it coming across in Europe, where it is specifically, and here we have a translation issue that's interesting. I think there's a historic effort to decide that Xiqu is opera. And even though there's very few sort of commonalities besides the fact that it is also music and also drama, and we don't get, it's not called no opera, right? For the Japanese versions get to keep their names. But the Chinese versions are sort of slotted into Chinese opera, and I think I'd like to see somebody's sort of philological following of the theater opera across, say, English, French, German, Dutch, Italian, because I think in earlier versions we hear a lot more about Chinese theater, earlier sort of reports. We hear more about Chinese theater, and then there's a concerted effort to say it's opera, because opera will give it that highbrow status in the European environment. And it's sort of kept that status in France, Germany, Russia, Italy. And I think that has to do with various modes of transmission. All right, so that's sort of a thesis. So yeah, so what makes the reception of Chinese drama theater so regionally variable? And here I'm talking about regions of the world. And so what are the histories of exchange, and why do they seem to be different classes of theater? Why do they enter China, Indonesia, Southeast Asia in general, in such more, in such vernacular forms, but into Western languages in more highbrow forms. This has to do with a related thesis or area of my work, where I'm trying to figure out, because we tend to just take diaspora as a given and say, well, there's a diaspora in the Philippines and there's a diaspora in Canada, and the way that the theaters operate are the same. People might not say that, but I don't think we've had a lot of very concerted thinking through of the categories of the ways that Chinese theater went places. And some of them, and I'm not talking, in some remote history, I mean, throughout. So The Liuanxi one, I would say, is a diplomatic exchange. That is to say, there's money from one government. In some of the Liuanxi troops, it's the French and the Chinese governments. Maybe it's through a public theater, you know, and so it's not directly government funding, but it's from public funds in order to bring world theater, right? We get that kind of stuff. Usually when there's productions that are done at universities, sometimes it's that kind of funding. Then we have migrant theater. So that's, you know, the history of Vancouver Cantonese opera. The history of Cantonese opera in San Francisco or of New York has recently been more about what is the migrant community doing in terms of theater. And that is, in Europe, mostly only the UK, right? We don't really get Cantonese opera done in Paris or Berlin or Madrid by resident Chinese. At least that hasn't happened very much. In an earlier period, we had a lot of commercial theater. So the early Cantonese opera history, you know, in Vancouver, but also in Southeast Asia, is about, we have a troupe, there is an audience, this is worth our while, this makes money, right? There is a history of commercial travel, which I think is still active in parts of Southeast Asia. For instance, in Sumatra, I recently, just before COVID, saw troops that were invited from Fujian because they didn't have a local troupe to do Chaozhou theater or Fujian theater, so they invited them over. And it's been in the news to some degree in Indonesia because then some actors have overstayed their visas and got deported. But we can verify that there's a market for it. That market, and I don't want to go into it too much, but that commercial market, which still exists now, is partly ritual. It's partly because the temple has a festival, therefore you need the troupe. If you can't get the troupe locally, then you better get them from somewhere else. And I see it a little bit in Penang, in southern Thailand, Sumatra, that sort of stuff is going on. But it used to be very common. It used to be that the troops traveled abroad, mostly to Southeast Asia, but the early American history in both North and Latin America was also commercial. And nowadays, much more restricted commercial opportunities. And the final version that I'm sort of talking about today, I'm talking about something that originated in a migrant transmission, and something that in the Euro-American world originated in an academic transmission. That is to say, the early accounts of Chinese theater, both the sort of what is Chinese theater and how does it work and how is it different from our theater, but also the first translations are sinological. That is to say, the translations into French and English and German, and to a much lesser extent into Italian and Russian, are not because people are traveling to France or Germany, but because the emerging institutions of the study of China, mostly in the 19th century, translate dramas, and it enters, there begins to be a conception of world drama and comparative drama involving Chinese theater through those sinological translations. And I think that bears a lot on why we get these different highbrow, lowbrow, and why that scope, different classes of position for opera in different areas. All right, the abstract has some words that it has been brought to my attention might require some further explanation. So transadaptation is a word that sort of gets us out of the locked, the difficulty of is it a translation or an adaptation. A lot of theater works are not really, line by line translations. Chinese theater going abroad almost always needs adaptation. If it's switching languages, it typically needs to be both translated and shortened. But then there's all sorts of other adaptations that go on. If you go very hard for translation, then you sort of seem to be implying it's the translation of a specific text. If you go very hard for adaptation, you seem to be ignoring the part of the script that actually is a translation. Transadaptation, which originates not in theater translation, but in screen translation, can sort of let us out of that. I also find it useful for dealing with foreign terms, like today I'm dealing with a German and Indonesian. Indonesian and Malay texts often talk, like earlier texts talk about tersalin, which is like copied, but it's it's not.
Yeah.
It's an adaptation. There's a variety of Malay words that are used other than translation in their explanations of where this text comes from. So you get a version of the white snake in late colonial Malay or in Indonesian, and sometimes it'll say translated, but it won't say from what, right? What is the original text of Bai Shi Zhuan? It's translated from Chinese, or it's like retold, right? It's translated, but it's, there isn't necessarily a canonical text that it comes from, but it also isn't just an adaptation. It's not adapted from a specific text. It's not, it's not a new creation. It's not sold as a new creation. It's acclaimed to be an adaptation. So I found that category useful. The German one is Nachdichtung, which means sort of like, well, this is why we don't get this, Nachdichten, yeah, Nachdichtung and Nachdichten. So Dichten is to write poetry, and Nachdichten is to write poetry after something, according to something, on the basis of something. And Hundhausen, who's the German writer, translator, transadapter that I'm talking about today, described his versions of Chinese things as Nachdichtungen. And we lose a lot of the claim that Hundhausen made when people say he's a translator. Because as we'll see, his translation process was very particular. But he didn't actually claim to be translating. He claimed to be writing after, writing on the basis of. Inter-Asia, I'm using as a category against Euro-America. I find it useful because it neither claims that Asia is this one thing. If I was to Euro-American and Asian might sort of sound like I think that there's one thing that's happened in Asia, but obviously the Japanese-Korean transmission is very different from the Southeast Asian transmission, and within Southeast Asia probably as well. But it doesn't, if you go sort of intra-Asia, it maybe also has the effect of not separating the different cultures. It sounds like you're again dealing with a sort of closed box. So there's various more theoretically refined ways of putting it, but I found them useful terms for trying to describe what's going on between China and Southeast Asia. And transadaptation useful for embracing a variety of texts that are in some way both translated and adapted. So we're going to the Europeans first. Very briefly, there's an English, there's a French, there's a German one, but the really influential history of Chinese drama in the 18th and especially the 19th century of these translations occurs into French. There are the sort of most famous one is the translation of Zhao Shiguo without the verse, which is maybe an important part of Zhao Shiguo, by Abbé Joseph Henri, and that's famous because Voltaire adapts it into L'Orphelin de Chine, the Orphan of China, which is the first European representation of China that actually can trace its roots to a specific Chinese drama, as opposed to fancy fairy tale versions of China. Right? This is a text that although Voltaire's is very different from Clément's, it traces its roots to a particular classical Chinese text. Then we have Huilan Ji, which will become very famous as the Caucasian chalk circle. Stanislas Julien does several of them, Antoine Bazin does several of them, including the Lute that I was talking about, the Pibadi, the story of the Lute, which, as I said, we actually get it into Russian and into Latin and into Italian and into Malay. So it's one of these texts that is very useful for comparisons. When Chinese drama, so here you have the Zhao Shiguo, Zhao Shiguo, and here that's one of the Bazin translations of Yuan Zaiju. When the Chinese drama begins to be translated into European languages, there's a couple of reasons. One of them seems to be just that Western drama is held in relatively high regard by, as an art in this period. So there's an interest in creating a world theater or world drama history. It is, as you might expect, very hierarchical. So the focus, once they have translated some texts from Chinese and then want to write the world theater, they tend to sort of discuss Chinese theater in terms of its failings. This is, we have the classical theater and what has gone wrong in other forms of theater, and then they tend to also have a progressive view. So they tend to see the Ming Dynasty as producing, better theater than the Yuan Dynasty. For instance, some of the analyses really like the Lute because they find it psychologically more advanced than what you get in the Yuanzaji plays, which are much shorter. The dramas, one of the other reasons seems to be that they're easily accessible. They're easily accessible both because some of them have been collected, but also the language, as is often the case with theater, because you've got dialogue. The language is easier for people to read in a period where knowledge of Chinese is sort of in its infancy. So we get a lot of vernacular fiction, and we get drama because they are relatively easy to read. I mentioned that there was a translation of part of the Lute into Latin. The reason that it's translated into Latin is because it's included in a Jesuit primer for people planning to go to China. It's included in the first year, so they obviously think that it's sort of entry-level Chinese, which might astonish some current learners of Chinese, because I don't think anybody would be teaching Pipati in first-year Chinese. There's, compared to sort of philosophical text, there's relative ease of interpretation. It's pretty easy for them to tell what goes on. They crack the code of how Chinese theater is written relatively early. But particularly, one thing that I think has an impact on how it becomes and remains a sort of highbrow theater is because they're looking for tragedy. And they think of tragedy as the highest of arts. Sometimes someone like Schopenhauer thinks it's the highest of arts, bar sort of abstract music. But in any event, clearly all the all the 19th century all the 19th century beginnings of comparative theater and comparative literature rate tragedy above comedy, certainly, and then go looking for the Chinese tragedy. And that's partly why also I think the Lute, for instance, is attractive. But you can see that Jakarta is also, the first translation says, transadaptations, right? That's what we're looking for, and that is deeply influential on the Chinese canonization of both drama and fiction, because then under that analysis of theater, late 19th century and early 20th century Chinese intellectuals will say, well, where are our tragedies? And that is also sort of circles back. They tend to think, I think Zhao Shiguo really goes up, its stock really goes up in China because it's been translated into French. Right? Because the foreigners are interested in it, and because it fits a certain idea of tragedy, therefore it belongs higher in our canon than we've previously put it. And I think that happens with a bunch of these translated plays. Maybe I will not go into any further detail about the primacy of tragedy in reception. Just sort of, briefly point you to these early translations into French that produced the Kaukasische Kreidekreis of both Brecht and Klabund, so one of the most influential transmissions of Chinese theater into the West. Zhao Shiguo produces these adaptations in French, Italian, English, and Doyen and Pipati also. So all of the ones that are translated early into French sort of enter the Western canon of what's important in China. That's one of the ways we can sort of demonstrate, I think, why it enters at that academic sinological highbrow level and sort of retains that position till now, I think. All right, Vincenz Hundhausen, our sort of case study for the European transmission. Was first a lawyer, moved to China, became a professor of German at the Peking Imperial University, so at Beijing. And he lived in Beijing and produced many, like an incredible amount of Nachdichtungen, so transadaptations of Chinese text. Why are they not translations? They're not translations because he claimed not to speak Chinese, not to read Chinese. Now he lived in China very long, was an incredible sort of Sinophile, very knowledgeable about a variety of things. I find it hard to believe that he just didn't speak Chinese at all. I think probably he was competent in Chinese to some degree, but he certainly, when it came to the translations that he made, and he made a huge amount of them, he relied on Chinese friends. And so Feng Zhi, whom many of you will know as the translator of Rilke into Chinese, but also the sort of influential, probably wrote the best Chinese sonnets, you know, one of the influential sort of experimenter of Western poetic meter in modern Chinese. And he went to Insel, the Poplar Island, where Hundhausen had his villa, and he and other Chinese intellectuals, Feng Zhi having studied in Germany and speaking very good German, gave him line by line spoken translations. So they did the whole, and these are, you know, Pipaji, Xixiangji, they are not short plays, right? So there's hundreds of pages, and according to what we know of how they worked, he sort of told them to him in German, line by line, and then Hundhausen produced them in a literary German, which on the whole has had good reviews from literature people and bad reviews from sinologists, right? So he had first translated Latin. So we have the Oden des Hochats. I'm pointing that out because you can see that he's also intent on putting Chinese drama, philosophy, and fiction at a very elevated level, right? It's a classic, the way that Horace is a classic of world literature. So Oden des Hochats in deutscher Sprache. Then he produced Chinese poetry, mostly of all of classical poetry, with a focus on the Tang Shizongzi, the Tang Song poets. He translated Lao Tzu in this way, and you can see that he's also publishing them himself right there. This is a Verlag der Pekinger Pappelinsel. So it's his own at home. He's producing these beautiful editions of philosophy, poetry, and drama in German. Here on the right, in 1926, we have the first of the drama translations. That's Bestzimmer. Also with beautiful illustrations, and that's printed in Beijing and in Leipzig. You can see here that he's got Pibaji, you know, in the front material. It's next to a book about Confucius and understanding Confucianism. So again, it's sort of being positioned as a great classic. Those of you who read German, öffnen den Weg für die geistige Höchstentwicklung und kulturelle Reife des Menschlichsten aller Völker. So it opens a gaze on the high spiritual development and cultural ripeness of the most human of all the people. Of all the peoples, the most humane of all the peoples, maybe. That we previously only knew from art and from the art trade, from painting and the art trade. So it's being positioned as a classic of world literature. I wanted to just tip my hat to the bibliographer, Hartmut Wahlravens, because as you can imagine, these are things all printed in German in Beijing, which has since then gone through, the war and the Cultural Revolution and many other things that will destroy small runs of German publications in China. And a lot of the response, of course, was all in the German press of China. And Valravens, now 78, I believe, has spent has done just an incredible service to everybody in general on the German press of China, because many things that we otherwise wouldn't be able to find, and would think that wouldn't make any project on Hundhausen, that would make any project on Hundhausen impossible without them, have been collated by him in 4 books on Hundhausen. So it's just that we don't get a lot of, I don't think we're going to get a lot of, young sinological biobibliographers getting jobs. So tip of the hat to Professor Valravens. And in 1930, we have a picture of a production of Das Examen. So Das Examen is a selection from Pipaji, from the Lute. And you can see that it is Germans performing in German. It goes to Tianjin, it goes to Shanghai. Some of the productions also go to Switzerland and Austria. The actors go to Germany, and Hundhausen does not, because he is an anti-Nazi, and this is already the period after the seizure of power by Hitler. So he remains in Switzerland, I believe, while the troupe goes and performs a couple of shows in Germany. So it's really a remarkable instance of doing Chinese theater. The actors here are Germans and not Chinese, but we also have some mixed German-Chinese mixed actors recorded, as well as Chinese students who had returned from Germany participating in these events. So you can see here that this actor is named Susanna Wang and is doing the character of Zhao Wunyang, so the heroine of the Lute.
Josh, what is Bühnenspiel?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Bühnenspiel is Bühne is stage and Spiel is play, so yeah, theater stage. Yeah, theater. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
Is it just speaking parts only, or do they try singing as well?
So we have, it seems to have been a mix. From the reviews, it looks like Susanna Wang could sing some, but some of the reviews also say it is, lightly Oriental music or something, which suggests that it's a German composer who's done some maybe incidental music. But we have several records of European singing Jingju in Beijing in the 20s and 30s, at least at some kind of level. There are a couple of such records. Yeah.
Where did they get the costumes?
I don't have records about that. I mean, Hundhausen not only has a great network of Chinese intellectual friends, but he also knows everybody in the German expatriate community. He also knows good English. So between those 3 communities, I think that's how the funds are raised, but I don't know what I think there's a lot of Jingju costumes floating around Beijing at this time. So my guess is that they're genuine costumes, but I don't know more than that. This is from their Shanghai visit, so you can see it's sort of in the. You can see that this is Eric Noreen, who's about to head off with Sten Hedin into Central Asia. All right, this is the list of the transadaptations, the Nachdichtungen. For the stage, I'm not talking about the philosophical or lyric ones today. So Xixangji, Pipaji, Mudanting, all of them long plays, all of them done this way. And then he produced books. I just gave you a picture of one earlier for performance. So Das Examen is 3 scenes from the Lute, from Pipaji. Die beiden Gatten is also from the so die beiden Gatten means the 2 wives. These books are very rare and I haven't seen them, but it would seem obviously to be the end of Pipaji, where there's an awkward situation where he's but not awkward but not insoluble, because of course it's ultimately okay for him to have married twice. He just should have been a little more communicative. And the Mudanting, the Peking Pavilion, you can see the 6 scenes that are done, the Blumengarten, so we can assume that that's Yuan Jingmeng, and that's the beginning, where they're strolling through the garden. Yeah. And then I'm sort of impressed. During the war, they produced a literary journal in Beijing called Die Junke, so the junk in the sense of the boat, the Chinese boat, which just does like Chinese literary translation and introductions from 1940 to 1945 in German. They're very rare and not digitized, so I only have a couple of images, but in a future project. It's not necessarily very drama. I'm just, every time I read about it, I'm impressed that anybody would be printing German-Chinese cultural transmission literature in Beijing from 1940 to 1945. It seems impossible. Yeah, from his press, from the publication press. So here are some sort of assessments of him. Lute sort of calls him the pioneer in introducing the great plays of the Chinese dramatical tradition to Germany, again in this very classical vein, although also meant to actually be performed. I haven't seen any record of anybody performing them except his own troupe, so I don't think that it worked in those terms. You can see here the audience in a sober and highly intellectual mood about a successful attempt to adapt classical Oriental drama to a form appreciable by an Occidental public. So the sobriety and the intellectualness and the classicism of it, even somebody who's trying to bring it to an audience has to adopt that very high level. And here's he died in 1955, so this is from an obituary. Sort of giving him credit for conveying not only the sort of content and knowledge of the fables, but all the delicious ambience as it exists in works of classical Chinese literature. So, for now we will leave Hundhausen behind and go somewhere very different, and that's the Indonesian pathways of Chinese theater, and I hope that you'll sort of keep in mind the divergence and the comparison for two sort of very different projects, but both of which are intended to bring Chinese narratives to a general population. What you've got a picture there is you have the Wayang Behi, so the 12th puppet theater of Hokkien, which is performed still in Central and East Java. All right, so Nano Riantiarno sadly passed away in January. But he spent, so March 1st was the 46th anniversary of Teater Koma. They produced more than 150 productions in 46 years. It is really one of Indonesia's most prolific and most prominent theater groups. Teater Koma, based in Indonesia, but he was himself from Cirebon, so in West Java. And here he is with his wife, Nano Riantiarno. I think it's one of those cases where it's Nano's name on every production, but if you visit them during rehearsals, it was a family enterprise. They did the rehearsals at home. Their son is also very involved at home. Like they have a big stage area. Their archive is there. Their books are there. They're a great theater troupe to research, because you show up and they're like, "Oh, you're interested in production 46? Here is the scrapbook of everything every journalist wrote about it." So 46 years of work. I want to highlight that of the 150 production, there are a handful that are on Chinese themes. So I'm for the purposes of this presentation, this research project, I'm focusing on them, but I don't want that to obscure the fact that this company, Teater Koma, Koma means comma in Indonesia, because there's always something coming afterwards, as I was told. I don't want that to obscure the fact that they have done probably the most famous production of the Three Penny Opera in Indonesia. They have done Gogol, the Inspector General. They have done Genet. They have done Shakespeare. They've done The Mayor de Figaro. They've written their own plays as well. So it's an extremely wide-ranging field that they operate in, but they have made several very popular, very successful adaptations of Chinese narratives, and that's what I'm talking about today. All right, so I think the sort of English language bias of academic work in general and the geography of where influential institutions are means that we continue to have a lot more focus on like the Cantonese opera of BC and California. And then after that, of course, sort of Singapore and Malaysia have a lot more way in because there's a lot of institutions there that work both in English and Chinese. But that places that are outside of either the Sinophone or the Anglophone networks tend to be less prominent. And so Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia clearly have important histories of Chinese performance, Chinese theater, and in many cases we're just sort of starting to understand them. Obviously I spend a lot of time on the Indonesian stuff, so it's relatively clear to me, I hope. But then when I think it's like, when I'm in Penang and I think a little bit north, there's definitely been lots of theater in southern Thailand, lots of Chinese theater in southern Thailand for a long, long time. And maybe people are working on it in Thai, and I just can't see it. I just can't search it. It's not, I don't read Thai. It's not even a language that, if somebody is working in Hungarian and you just don't know any Hungarian at all, as most of us probably don't, you're still going to be able to recognize, Chinese words in Hungarian or titles or people's names or whatever. Even then, you would have some sort of. But the fact that Thai and Khmer are in different scripts means that I think we're losing big chunks of this history. But it is really one of it's sort of deeply tied to one of the greatest movements of population in world history. There's been older and there's been newer migrations, but the main sort of century is the mid-19th century to the Second World War. There is an enormous amount of migration that goes especially from Guangdong and Fujian provinces, so Hokkien and Cantonese speakers, all over Southeast Asia. Again, I think we tend to sort of think of the migration to North America. That's probably around here, that's where people are going to think of first. It is much smaller and much later than the migration to Southeast Asia. And so everywhere that we went, this is also the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, is also a period where everybody watches theater. I think it's part of everybody's life. It's true of the Chinese communities where they're from, and it's true of the Southeast Asian communities where they go to. It's before screens are that accessible, and it's just part of religious practice, it's part of commercial practice, it's part of general entertainment. So everywhere we go, we find records of theater, and in many places we find surviving traditions. All right, another sort of massive tip of the hat to Claudine Salmon, who is a French researcher and who compiled a list of all the publications that she could find at the time, this is I believe 1981, of texts in Malay. This is before Indonesian was formally called that. It's before the institution of a form of standardized Malay as Indonesian. So literature in Malay by the Chinese of Indonesia. She's not concerned with the peninsula, Malay Peninsula, so Penang, Singapore, which also have a lot of literature. And it's drama, it's fiction. It's an incredible book because it's sort of clearly typed up but has all these cross references. So I can look up Bai She Zhuan, I can look up White Snake and see, okay, it appeared as a drama, it appeared 3 times in 3 different translations, it appeared in Surabaya and in Semarang and in Bandung. Just a mammoth work. Only part of her general work, but really, if you want to see in one go how much Chinese stories were produced in Indonesia. Also, what's also interesting in a book I'm not interested in today particularly is there's a lot of the translations from French and Dutch and English and German are also by the Chinese of Indonesia. That is to say, a lot of the transmission of Western literature, Western drama is done sometimes by the same people. Sometimes you get the same person translating or copying or retelling from French or English as is working from Chinese. So I think it's very hard to underestimate the impact, very hard to overestimate the impact of this massive transmission of materials, publications of all literary genres by the Chinese of Indonesia in the late colonial period. So really sort of ramping up from the 1880s right to the Second World War, and to some degrees after independence as well. And I just wanted to highlight there's new interesting work going on about matching because they typically say, well, it's a translation of Sanguo, right? But if you work on late imperial Chinese studies, you're like, well, what edition, you know, what version of any Chinese text? Because it never says, you know, a text based on this particular edition. It only ever tells you here's the story of Whitesnake. Well, how did you get it? Which one? And so there's been really great research by a young, this is her PhD dissertation, now out as a book from a couple of years ago in Paris, good incidental student, sort of matching up, well, based on the Malay text, which actual Chinese editions is it coming from? And I think she's picked Sanguo because there's an incredible apparatus of work on Sanguo editions, so that's more feasible. But clearly it would be the same issue around a lot of these narratives, and in many cases the Chinese apparatus won't be as developed in telling us, well, where are these editions and how did they get to Indonesia and the rest of it. Why am I talking about this? It's because it's hundreds and hundreds of texts flooding, I mean, sort of flooding is probably the wrong idea, because they're produced in Indonesia by people of Chinese descent, and they're produced for a mass market. It's clear from their prices and from their advertisements that that it's intended to be read generally by the educated public mostly on Java, but in the Dutch East Indies. So it's, we can presume that they were perhaps especially likely to be read by people who are of ethnic Chinese background, but everything indicates that, like the theater, like the puppets, it is not being conducted in sort of ethnically segregated consumption, and it means that some of these stories become widely known and remain widely known among Indonesian readers and viewers. Here is one picture. So this is a Xu Xian, called here Hanbun, so Hanwen, lending his umbrella at Westlake. So those of you who know the story of Whitesnake will recognize that here we are at Westlake. Here's an example from Sampai Engtai, known sometimes in English as the Butterfly Lovers. This is a sort of star-crossed lover story, sometimes known as the Chinese Romeo and Juliet, and we get many, many versions of Sampai Engtai, right, Sampai Engtai, as comic books, as stories, as records, as being part of a puppetry production, but then also being turned into songbooks and television series and regional Javanese theater. So it becomes, and also the case in Malaysia. I don't want to suggest that people forget that it's a Chinese story. Right? When it appears, it's always clearly marked as, well, here's something that happened in China, or when we get to the version by Riantiarno, it's often indicated that, like, it's set in Batavia, so in Jakarta, and in Banten, I think, in Western Java. But the characters are Chinese people. Like, we haven't forgotten that it's a Chinese story, even when it's set in Java. So I don't want to suggest it sort of dissolves into a commonly held narrative trove without any indication. It still remains recognized as a Chinese story. And some Pekeng Tai also sort of, the name continues to suggest the origins, but it becomes something that anybody can adapt and that anybody can put to music or produce. Here we have Xi Jinghui, so Xue Engui. This was a very popular comic book series. We have some from the 30s, we have some from the 50s. And here it is in a version called Wayang Cina Jawa. So this is a Jakarta Chinese puppeteer who used Chinese stories, doesn't seem to have known Chinese himself, performed in Javanese, but knew these stories from community, from older members of community, or he might have read them in the, in the many versions that were translated. And we get the translations not only into Malay, we get far fewer, but we get translations also into Javanese, into Balinese, into Madurese, also into other archipelagical languages. So you can see that it's done according to, basically in the style of Wayang Kulit, so in the style of Javanese puppetry in Jakarta for the story, and the music was also Javanese, but the story is a Xue Engui story. When I've spoken to people, to Javanese puppeteers, they pointed out that it's not that, because the heads are detachable, it is actually distinguishable. Like you can tell not only from how they look and the story and whatever, it is, he also made alterations to how the puppetry is made. It's kind of a different genre materially as well. So he's not, he's also innovating in the creation of the puppets. And another sort of piece of evidence that I could have used for this presentation today is the way that these puppets are now being made, reproduced, like they're making copies of them, and are doing these stories again, or are doing new stories based on these materials. So once Chinese narratives and Chinese stories became feasible again for the stage, and once it was politically possible to do Chinese Indonesian performing arts, we've seen initiatives of this kind in many different genres. Here is the white snake again. So you can see it's actually its Indonesian or its Malay title Upai Tua is also Upai, so Uyadu. So it's black snake and white snake. It's really interesting actually that it's not green snake, it's dark snake. So that seems to be a Hokkien thing. But there's two versions. You can see this is anaknya siluman ular, so this is the children of the white snake. I don't know why King Kong is there. It's hard to do research on these films because, like all other colonial films, we don't have the film. The film is lost. Not all other sort of Spielfilm, all other feature films. Right? We have some documentary films, but we don't have anything more than snippets of commercial films from the colonial period. And the Chinese influence on the commercial film industry of the Dutch East Indies is enormous. A lot of the actors are of Chinese origin, and a lot of the stories are of Chinese origin, and a lot of the producers are. The sort of film historians made some interviews with the performers, which make it clear that they were drawing on sort of theater tricks for the transformation from beautiful woman to snake in the white snake narrative. So there's a close connection between these early films and the sort of vernacular theater versions of white snake, and the same would apply to other Chinese narratives. So we see it in comic books, we see it on the stage as puppets in the early film history. It is all over late colonial Indies culture. At the same time, it's a lot of the stories are preserved in temples, particularly puppetry is one of the places that puppetry is one of the genres, especially Wayang Potehi, so the Hokkien glove puppet theater, is historically often performed in temples, continues to often be performed in temples, also in Fujian and Taiwan and Penang and Singapore. But it's sort of quite crucial for the maintenance of Chinese narratives. because temples can somewhat be protected from the ban on Chinese culture during the Suharto years. So from the late to mid 60s to 1998, it is more or less illegal, although there are people find ways of getting around it to have expressions of Chinese culture in public. But if it is categorized as religion, and in a temple, which is a Buddhist temple, although it's probably, generally speaking, it's Tridharma, so it's Sanjiao, it's a mix of Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, but it gets categorized as Buddhism. Buddhism is a permissible religion, also a religion with an important Indonesian pedigree, and as a result, puppetry and various rituals that might also be performances can continue to be conducted in temples. So we find that these narratives continue to remain familiar to people, partly because the puppets, the Potehi puppets, Udaishi, remain active really throughout the entire period, coming to various locally negotiated agreements with local government or police or whoever. But I think it's really sort of an important line for some of these stories, because when we get to the generation of Nano Riantiarno, the theater director, he knows some of these stories, for instance, the Xi Jinghui story, the Xue Rengui story, because he had seen Potehi as a child and as a young man. Here are the comics. Skip this bit, and we can see that Potehi is now sort of integrated into various claims to Indonesianness. So it is clearly a genre of Hokkien origin, Budaishi, but because it comes into Indonesia probably already in the 18th century, but most of the troops now are descended from arrivals in the late 19th century. Because it's a puppet form, it can sort of apply to be considered a form of wayang, right? And so it sells itself, or the patrons of the art want to promote it as a Chinese contribution to Japanese arts or to Indonesian arts, by analogy, because it's a puppetry and it has a ritual function, the way a lot of wayang kulit, wayang golek also have ritual functions. Therefore, it's Potehi, sure, it's of Chinese origin, but it is 100% Indonesian. And that's something, often it's sort of performed with Indonesian flags. Sometimes I've been to performances where there was a song that came before that was, although I am of Chinese origin, I am a daughter of Indonesia, were the lyrics. You can see here it's Wayang Potehi, Indonesia for the world. And so there's quite a hard, forthright campaign to make it a kind of wayang, and as part, as integrated into Indonesian accounts of performing arts as one ethnic art among others, and not asing, right? Not foreign in any meaning. It came from somewhere abroad at some remote time, but now it's here, and it's the local ethnic Chinese contribution to Indonesian, to wayang, to Indonesian performing arts. As you might guess, this has a very receptive audience among pluralist Indonesians with a wide idea of what Indonesian culture can and should be, including, say, the Javanese department of Universitas Indonesia, is very receptive to this as a Sino-Javanese art. It is not so, like that claim that it's a wayang is not accepted by people with a narrower or a more chauvinistic account of what it is to be Indonesian or Javanese. All right, so Potehi is one origin for these Riantiarno versions, like the Whitesnake production that I showed you right at the beginning. Another that was really interesting is right in 1992-1993, you get the Taiwanese what's it called? 新传奇, right? 百社新传奇, I think. It's hugely popular in Taiwan, in the PRC, version of 百社传 that was among the first Chinese language shows that was permitted to be shown in Indonesia dubbed. And there was a huge sort of vogue for Ulat Putih. So this is the rebroadcast, much more recently, as you can tell from all the Twitter and whatever. But this is the show, and Chinese Indonesians in oral interviews and by anthropologists and sociologists remember this as an important moment where it becomes visible again on the screens to see elements of Chinese culture and whether the show was permitted. The White Snake version by Teater Koma, so by Nano Riantiarno's troupe, is 1994, and the troupe has never been, coy about its inspirations. It takes them from popular culture, it takes them from television, it takes them from whatever is sort of commercially interesting, right? And it does, it produces them and plays with them and jokes with them in whatever way seems to them relevant and commercial. I should say it's a troupe that's been really remarkable about retaining quite a lot of satirical relevance, about criticizing, say, Indonesian politics, and its various plays about corruption that are cited as serious satires of the political system, while remaining a commercial troupe. Right, the government support for performing arts in Indonesia, or especially for modern performing arts in Indonesia, is very low, and so they have very much to consider the box office when they do their productions. So they draw from everything. When they were doing Wei, which is later, Xi Jinping, they also drew on the Chinese television series, which by that time they could get on the computers. This is 2010, that the first of the Xi Jinping was done. So influences from across the popular culture, including Chinese, Taiwanese television. The three versions, the three sort of major productions are Sampai Engtai, so The Butterfly Lovers, done in 1988, and because he was doing a Chinese play in Indonesia during the Suharto period, this is the play that gave him the most political problems. It was shut down once in Jakarta and once in Medan, but it was produced for several shows before it was shut down. It was shut down on the pretense that it didn't have the local performance license, but it was pretty clear to everybody that it was shut down for having too much Chinese material. But the Chinese Indonesians, again in oral histories, it's not done by me, by colleagues, repeatedly say it was important to see Chinese ritual on stage, to see, for instance, Sampai Engtai has or Chinese celebration on stage. Sampai Engtai has a scene with a ulong, with a dragon dance. And so that was banned on the street, but because it was sort of fictional, it was tolerated for a while until he was interrogated. But it was a way that that the Chinese identity could sort of be, or Chinese narrative could be shown in some way, they could sort of gray area, yeah. They found a gray area in which they could perform the Chinese theater. Ulat Putih, the White Snake, 1994, is sort of towards the end of the Suharto period, and the restrictions on Chinese content at that time were still in force, but maybe getting a little looser. What I find really interesting about White Snake is that it seemed, White Snake is, the story that many of you will know is about a snake who, through devotion and through sort of also, intense study, is able to transform herself into, at least apparently, a human, a beautiful young woman. However, and she's a positive character in most versions that we get nowadays. The earlier versions are a little more ambiguous, but mostly she falls in love with Xu Xian, and she's a good wife to him and loves Xu Xian. Xu Xian loves her back, and Xu Xian is a little feeble. Xu Xian is open to the influence of monks who say, well, you may not live with a snake. But actually she retains her faithfulness and is sort of a tragic model mother in a lot of the versions. Model wife and model mother.
Sometimes comic.
Yes, sometimes comic.
He can be handpicked.
Yes.
He's domineering.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the way that Riantiarno wrote this script, it's very hard not to read it because it's got these little political scenes. For instance, there's a scene where Whitesnake goes into heaven, and suddenly she's asked for she and Greensnake are asked for their ID cards. And the ID cards, Chinese Indonesians felt officially it was not the policy that on your ID card you could see what the ethnicity of the person was, but Chinese Indonesians felt that the sequence of numbers on their ID card indicated who was Chinese and who was not, and that at traffic stops they were likely to be asked for bribes because they were thought to be wealthy, and so there, the jokes around ID card and having gone, and there's jokes around for sort of like inventing rules that you don't know about until you've broken them and now you have to pay the fine. They all seem to be about that sort of central conceit, which works for Whitesnake, about it doesn't matter how hard you try or how much you cultivate yourself, you're always going to be from another world. You're always going to be. And I think in some ways it's quite a bitter, in moments it's quite a bitter play, although at the end it, depending on the version, can also have a positive resolution. So to produce that in 1994, I think said to many people that it was an exploration, a comic, and sometimes tragic exploration of what it meant to be Chinese in Indonesia. It's not the only way of reading the play, and I don't think it applies at every point of the play, but it's certainly part of how it's written. Xi Jinping, all of these have been revived. Xi Jinping is a tetralogy. So there's 4 huge productions of the Xuanhui story done between 2010 and 2017. It's really one of the sort of massive theater projects of our century in Jakarta, to do the whole sort of, to do Xuanhui and Xuanhui's son, Xuegang, and Fan Lihua, the daughter-in-law, and they're Qing stories about the Tang, and they're sort of about fighting the Koreans and fighting the Tibetans, but they're sort of deeply localized, deeply Indonesianized, and they're done more, I think generally speaking, they're done, always to entertain, but also always with some sort of commentary about what's going on in Indonesian politics and society. So here you have some visuals, so you can see again a mix of inspiration, sometimes from this is inspiration, sometimes from Chinese theater. Also, because they're watching movie versions of National Times, so sometimes they're copying movement vocabulary, sometimes they're copying costumes, but they are completely unafraid of altering them so that they're funny or so that they they serve a purpose. And if you watch something like something in Thai, it's very hard to describe the musical style, because at one moment it'll be kind of jazzy, and then it'll be kind of country, and then it'll be kind of dangdut, it'll be Indonesian, probably, and sometimes it'll be kind of fake Chinese opera. It'll be like whatever their composer thought might be Chinese opera. And then throughout, you'll also have inspirations and borrowings from other Indonesian genres. Like these are inspired by the Batavian street of the Ondel. Here's some posters from the Xi Jinping, and then you can see also that they're borrowing sort of wayang kulit for scenes of Xi Jinping. All right, so yes, we have Whitesnake. Here you have Phi. Here's the monk who is going to interfere. And when I look at this script, one of the sort of side projects I've got going at the moment is to look at the script and to see, well, which of the Malay sources, or is he borrowing when he's Riantiarno borrowing when he's doing his Indonesian script. Sometimes we can see he's borrowed, like when he uses pinyin, for instance. When he uses pinyin is a PRC, romanization system. It's only really adopted abroad from the 1960s. And if there's a pinyin character or something, then I can be fairly certain that its immediate origin, where he's borrowing it from, is something that comes out of a more recent, probably PRC television series or something like that, or translation, rather than when it's written, when it says Hanbun, right, or which is Xu Xian, right? It's Hanwen, Xu Hanwen. Then it's clearly taking its cue from a Hokkien source, probably an older text that's coming to Malay. So really sort of an eclectic, popular version that borrows from all available versions of the story. You can see the great green snake appearing there. And again, I've given you these pictures just so you can see how it borrows from many different vocabularies of costuming and performance. All right. This is Riantiarno when he revived White Snake in 2015. Because at least the legal sides of discrimination or bans on Chinese culture had been repealed, I think fewer people were likely to read it, White Snake, as a Chinese-Indonesian text, right? As a text about being ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. And Riantiarno said, yeah, for the revival in 2015, he wanted it more to be about questions of humanity, questions of sort of general, how to be humans, honest and free of corruption. So I think he wanted on revival for it to be a trans-ethnic script talking about what are our responsibilities, and can the president, this is just after the election of Jokowi, so can the president now expel the demons who really are evil? I think he was beginning to feel that the new government was not going to deliver not deliver on the hopes that many had held in them. All right, so obviously this goes in many different directions, and my hope for this project is to try and take case studies and see where we go with them. This is obviously beautiful PowerPoint work. It's not at all just a snip from a Word document. But this is sort of where I am right now. So Inter-Asian, the origins are popular, migrational, large scale, and I mean there's an enormous amount of material that went into Malay and later Indonesian, and that the productions are eclectic. They borrow from whatever they think is useful. The results is that it's casting blind, I don't know, it's not sensitive to casting. It doesn't feel like Chinese people have to play Chinese characters, which I think is a big obstacle in getting Chinese narratives on the Western stage, right? Because it's going to, you can cast Asin any way you like, you can cast Calderón de la Barca any way you like, you can cast Greek plays any way you like, but if you're going to do the Lute in English, you will need to have a very clear idea of why you're casting, how you're casting. And that doesn't apply in Indonesia. It doesn't have that anxiety. The results in Indonesia, it's mostly things that came into archipelagic cultures a long time ago, 100 years ago or earlier. What I mean by that is Xi Jinggui is not a major narrative in China. Right? Xi Jinggui, it was very popular when there was the large migration, and it's maintained its popularity there, more really than it's maintained its popularity in China. And that means that there is a sort of local repertoire of Chinese narratives, some of them very famous and also the ones that are famous here, like White Snake, and some of them not. And it retains a mass audience. It has at least some reach into a general theater reader population. It's not only the people who are thinking about what is world literature, what is world theater, who are interested in it. The Euro-American, at least its heritage, has been elite, has been sinological, has been small scales, productions and a much smaller number of translations. The translators have tended to be people in universities. And it tends to have classical sources. That is to say, it tends to be interested in classical printed versions of the plays that also have the highest canonical status in the Chinese world. Right? It tends to be borrowing at that highbrow level. It's much more casting sensitive. I don't think it has an established existing repertoire. I don't think that there are huge amounts of Chinese narratives that just have general recognition. Whitesnake and Journey to the West, Monkey King, maybe are those that most have them, but I think it's much lower than in Southeast Asia. And that means that there's maybe also more room for new translations, new projects, but there's a lot of, when there is a Chinese play that comes into English, it often is sort of a new element of repertoire. It's sort of more likely to be reinventing the wheel. I don't know, it's more likely to be, well, here's this Chinese play, I've translated it, let's do a production of it, rather than drawing on established systems of repertoire. I don't think we really have that in the Euro-American systems. So that's a lot to throw at everybody, and I've gone a lot of time, but thank you very much for your, and I'm very, very interested in